Imagine deciding to do a small renovation in your basement, hitting the floor with a shovel, and behind it, a hollow void. But this isn't an old sewer or a neighbor's cellar. This is the entrance to a massive labyrinth that goes 18 meters deep and stretches beneath all the streets where you walk every day to buy bread. That is exactly how a resident of the Iranian city of Nushabad discovered that another world begins beneath his rug. While his neighbors were watching TV or arguing in the kitchen, he stood on the threshold of a system capable of quietly swallowing thousands of people. These are not abandoned ruins in a far-off desert. Nushabad is a living city just 5 kilometers from Kashan. For centuries, cars have driven here, shops were built, and families were started, completely unaware that right under the soles of their shoes, a completely different story was simmering, with its own ventilation, water supply, and even toilets. But how could such a massive system be built and manage to hide its existence for more than 1,500 years? Why did none of those who walked these streets for decades hear a single sound from underground? What force made an entire population abandon sunlight and go live in total darkness, turning their homes into double-bottomed traps? The main secret of Nushabad is not that it was found, but how it managed to remain invisible while enemies stood right on the roofs of these underground halls. To understand exactly what these people were fleeing from, we'll have to go to the surface. Because the scorching sun of Iran was only the most harmless of their enemies. Imagine you are standing on a giant, red-hot frying pan. The air burns your throat, and the sun literally sucks the life out of you. In central Iran, 50 degrees in the shade in summer is a common occurrence. Sweat evaporates instantly, and the wind, instead of relief, flings hot dust into your face that scratches your skin. Living on the surface in such an oven means constantly fighting for every breath of cool air. But take just a few steps down, and you enter another world. There, beneath a thick layer of earth, the temperature drops to a comfortable 25 degrees. The earth acts like a huge natural thermos. While stone melts above, a pleasant freshness remains below. Iranians learned to use this trick thousands of years ago. They built qanats, underground channels that pulled water for tens of kilometers through the desert, preventing it from drying up. They built ice houses and hid rooms in deep basements. Nushabad became a logical continuation of this tradition, but what was built there was no longer just a place for summer rest. Fierce heat pushed people underground, forcing them to seek salvation in the cool soil. But the scorching sun was far from the only reason to voluntarily descend into the darkness of 3 levels. There was an enemy far more dangerous and merciless. Central Iran was for thousands of years a thoroughfare for endless conquerors. Mongols, Arabs, Turks, Persian armies, entire avalanches of soldiers rolled across these arid lands. And for an ordinary civilian, every such appearance on the horizon meant a death sentence. In the open desert, hiding is an almost impossible task, as there are no dense forests, high mountains, or deep gorges to get lost in. On a flat and bare plateau, any person is visible for dozens of kilometers, like a target on a white sheet. Any smoke from a fire or dust raised by horse hooves instantly gave away the location of a village. The traditional solution in those times was to build high fortress walls, but for a small settlement like Nushabad, it was too expensive, too slow, and often simply pointless against massive hordes. Running across the scorched sand also made no sense. The invaders' cavalry would have caught the fugitives in just half an hour, leaving not a single chance for escape. Therefore, the residents chose a unique third path. They simply disappeared from view. They went deep down and became absolutely invisible to any enemy looking for easy prey on the surface. The invaders entered an empty city, saw abandoned houses, and could not understand where hundreds of people had gone. But it's one thing to crawl into a cramped hole for a couple of hours, and quite another to hide the entire population of a city there for several weeks or even months. For this, an ordinary burrow or basement would not suffice. That is why the Nushabad underground eventually turned into a complex engineering system of 3 full levels with dozens of rooms and long passages. For people to realistically wait out a long siege, absolutely everything had to be inside. Reliable food supplies, constant access to fresh water, and most importantly, and inflow of fresh air were needed. People required a place to sleep and at least some minimal conditions to keep from going insane from the thick darkness and cramped quarters during those endless days while the enemy held sway right above their heads. This city wasn't built from a single finished blueprint over a weekend. It grew and improved over centuries. Each new invasion of enemies brought the residents bitter but valuable experience. People understood in practice exactly where ventilation was lacking and where an additional emergency tunnel needed to be dug urgently in case of a collapse. What we see today under Nushabad is not just a pile of caves, but the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge on how to turn the ordinary soil beneath your feet into an impregnable, hidden, and quite comfortable fortress. But digging rooms in the ground is only half the battle. The real engineering wonder begins where the masters of the past come in, having managed to make this massive enclosed stone bag breathe and function as a single, complex, and living organism. How did they solve the issue of air and hygiene so that hundreds of people didn't suffocate in the cramped space? The depth of this insane labyrinth ranges from 3 to 18 meters. These are 3 full residential tiers connected to each other by narrow stairs and steep vertical passages. Imagine a modern apartment building that has simply been flipped and driven deep into the ground. On each floor, endless corridors stretch out, leading to individual rooms. Niches and shelves for lamps and belongings are neatly carved into the walls. Everything here is thought out so that you don't feel trapped. But the most striking part is the air. How could hundreds of people breathe at a depth of 18 meters without electric fans or pumps? This is true magic of ancient engineering. The builders of Nushabad turned the entire city into a giant stone lung. Clever ventilation tunnels pass through the entire complex, driving a fresh stream from the very entrances to the furthest and deepest dead ends. The people below breathed as easily as those who remained on the surface. The masters of the past understood the physics of air movement and knew at what angle and what size a shaft needed to be struck so that the temperature difference would create a natural draft. They created a system that worked on its own, without a single blueprint or a complex device. There was water, supplied through special channels, and storerooms filled to the brim with food. But even more surprising is how they solved the problem of hygiene. Separate drainage channels for toilets were arranged in Nushabad. Sanitation was so well thought out that the shelter did not turn into a stinking pit even after several weeks of dense occupation. This entire complex worked as a single, well-oiled mechanism, allowing an entire city to remain safe while war raged above. It was not like a chaotic cave for refugees. The internal spaces resembled a long hotel corridor where each family had its own separate room. This division into private cells turned a military facility into a real residential space. People didn't sit in a single heap in the dark. They continued to live as an organized community, just several floors below their usual homes. It was a full-fledged city with its own rules and order, which continued to function despite being underground. Inside, everything was created so that life would not stop even in total isolation. But for this ideal system to work, the most important and difficult task had to be solved: how to discreetly lead hundreds of people underground at the very moment when the enemy is already on your street and looking into your windows. In Nushabad, every front door was a deception, and every hearth a potential hatch into another dimension. While a stranger saw an ordinary kitchen with hanging utensils and the smell of fresh flatbread, the locals viewed this interior as a complex camouflage system. No massive city gates or wide grand staircases were built here that would give away the shelter at first glance. The entire city was literally stitched with secret passages that turned ordinary residential blocks into a giant sieve capable of instantly swallowing thousands of people. One of the cleverest moves involved using ordinary bread ovens, tanners. In the morning, bread was baked in such an oven, and in case of danger, the hot coals were shoveled out, and the double bottom opened a path into the cool darkness of the tunnel. Another entrance could hide for years at the bottom of an ordinary drinking well. To get inside, one had to know a secret sequence of protrusions in the stonework that served as steps and led to a dry side corridor above the water level. A third passage was skillfully camouflaged in the dark corners of storerooms behind enormous clay jars of oil or grain. For any enemy soldier bursting into a house, it was an absolutely ordinary dwelling. Not a single detail indicated that right under his boots, beneath a layer of earth several meters thick, hundreds of people were hiding at that very moment. The camouflage was so perfect that even the most meticulous search yielded no results. This allowed the entire population of Nushabad to dissolve into space in a matter of minutes. A family simply pushed aside a heavy chest, lowered a lid that blended in texture with the rest of the floor, and silently went down, sealing the world of the living behind them. This knowledge, exactly where the secret lever was located, or which stone in the wall needed to be pressed, was the primary family heirloom. It wasn't trusted to paper and wasn't discussed even with close neighbors. Fathers spent years preparing their sons for that single moment when they would have to lead their loved ones into the shadows, and mothers whispered to their daughters the secret of how to tightly close the lock from the inside, so that not even an accidental smell or sound would leak through to the top. A house with an exit to the labyrinth was not just a roof over one's head, but a real chance for salvation that was valued more than any inheritance. Such a system made Nushabad an invulnerable ghost. While enemies wandered aimlessly through the empty streets above, organized life continued underground. But as soon as the secret hatch slammed shut behind the last person, the hardest trial began. Any mistake, any accidental rustle or flash of light could turn this ideal shelter into a mass grave for thousands of people. The second the sentries signaled the enemy's approach, Nushabad transformed into a perfectly tuned mechanism. It wasn't like a panic-stricken flight, with people scurrying through the streets in terror, obstructing each other. If hundreds or even thousands of people had simultaneously rushed to the secret hatches without a clear plan, the city would have simply crushed itself in the narrow tunnels. Moving underground was a strict, almost military operation where everyone knew their maneuver. Families retreated to their homes, slid the bolts, and disappeared into the depths of the soil in a strict sequence. Inside the labyrinth, there was no chaos of a common pile. Each family occupied its own specific room, which had been assigned to them for decades. This division into private cells was the main guarantee of survival. In an enclosed space where people are forced to spend weeks in total darkness and cramped quarters, any minor dispute over a sleeping spot could escalate into a bloody fight. Order and discipline underground were more important than the stock of arrows on the surface. People lived in an organized community where peacetime rules continued to function even at a depth of dozens of meters. Life underground was maintained through cold calculation made back in the days of peace. Air circulated silently through the shafts, water arrived through hidden channels, and in the storerooms, mountains of grain and jars of oil awaited their hour. These stocks were replenished in advance, many months before the first enemy rider appeared on the horizon. The people in Nushabad understood a simple truth. A shelter that is not ready to receive guests at any second is not a fortress, but a mass grave. They kept their tunnels in perfect order, as a living part of the city infrastructure, not as a dusty museum in case of trouble. While the invaders wandered in confusion through the empty, dusty streets above, life bustled beneath their boots. In total silence, by the dim light of oil lamps, people prepared food so that smoke wouldn't give away their location, and discussed news in whispers. The city simply changed floors, going a few meters down, and continued to function while waiting for the threat to disappear as suddenly as it had appeared. This cycle of disappearance and return was repeated for centuries, becoming a commonplace occurrence. But the most interesting part is that the underground city was never idle, even when absolute peace reigned on the surface. It turned out that the fierce heat and Mongol arrows were far from the only reasons to go down. You might think that Nushabad was something like a giant fire extinguisher. It hangs on the wall, everyone knows where it is, but nobody touches it until something catches fire. But if that were the case, the city would not have survived to this day. The tunnels would have been choked with dust, the stairs would have crumbled, and the ventilation would have been completely clogged with sand in the first 50 years. The underground was preserved in such perfect condition for only one reason: it was almost never empty. For the locals, this labyrinth was not just a bunker for a big war, but their usual summer home. When July arrived on the surface and the heat consistently crossed 50 degrees, life above literally stood still. On such days, being under the direct rays of the sun is like voluntarily crawling into a red-hot oven. And then, all of Nushabad moved several tiers down, quite naturally and mundanely. It wasn't a flight or a panic, but became an ordinary seasonal habit repeated year after year. People descended into the cool halls with their belongings and food to simply wait out the hottest hours in comfort. It was precisely this daily exploitation that made the city so technically perfect. You see, there is a huge difference between an item used once a century and one you need every summer. If you spend 3 months a year underground, you will make sure that trash doesn't accumulate in the corridors, that the water in the channels stays fresh, and that the air moves correctly. Imagine a housewife cleaning a room at a depth of 18 meters in the morning, simply because she is going to have lunch there today. Imagine men checking the supports in a common corridor because their children will soon be running through it. Maintaining order underground wasn't some feat for future generations. It was a simple matter of personal convenience, here and now. In Iranian culture, it has always been common to seek salvation in the shadow of the earth. For centuries, there was a tradition of building houses with deep basements, but Nushabad became the most massive and daring expression of this idea. It was a city with a dual operating mode. In winter and spring, people lived above ground among gardens and open streets. But as soon as the sun began to burn away everything living or strangers appeared on the horizon, everyone went down. This double life saved Nushabad from oblivion. The city didn't turn into an abandoned monument of the past because it remained a living tool. It worked flawlessly for centuries, adapting to any threat. And it was precisely this amazing preservation that allowed us to find it after so much time. Although, to be honest, no one set out to look for it specifically. Everything was decided by an ordinary coincidence. Try to grasp the scale of this silence. An entire city beneath your feet was simply forgotten. It wasn't sought for decades because no one even guessed there was something to look for. In Nushabad's history, not a single ancient chronicle remains that points directly. Here, beneath our streets, an enormous 3-level labyrinth is hidden. Even oral legends faded over time and turned into ordinary old wives' tales that none of the modern residents took seriously. Human memory turned out to be too short compared to the longevity of the earth, which knows how to keep secrets for millennia without giving them away by even a sound. Everything changed by a pure, almost impossible accident. When an ordinary resident of the city started a renovation and drove a shovel into the ground under his floor, he didn't plan to become a discoverer. He just wanted to lay a new pipe or expand his basement. But instead of the dense, familiar soil, his tool fell into a hollow void. At first, the man thought it was just an old cesspool or an abandoned cellar. But when he went down into that breach and walked along the wall, the tunnel didn't end after a couple of meters. It began to branch out, to go sideways, to sink deeper and deeper, revealing before him an entire suite of empty rooms. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a real shock for researchers. The further they advanced into the depths of this dark world, the clearer it became. They were not facing an accidental shelter for one person, but a giant, clearly planned network that permeates the entire soil beneath the residential blocks. It turned out that beneath shops, roads, and the foundations of modern buildings, a complex system was hidden that people had built and maintained for hundreds of years. No one expected to find such a massive man-made creation where life on the surface seems so simple and clear. But the strangest thing about this discovery is that it is still incomplete. We see only a small part of what is hidden underground. Most of this labyrinth remains inaccessible, not because someone is hiding it on purpose, but because a living, bustling city has grown over it during the past centuries. Modern Nushabad has become for its ancient double both a reliable shell and a primary barrier. It protects the tunnels from destruction by the outside world, but at the same time, it seals the passages tightly with its foundations and utilities. And this neighborhood of two eras, separated by just a few meters of earth, creates a threat that no one thought of when the first worker's shovel struck the void. The greatest tragedy of Nushabad is that its main threat wasn't Mongol hordes or the scorching sun, but ordinary human ignorance. For decades, people lived in their cozy homes, watched TV, and went about their chores, never suspecting that a unique history lurked right beneath their feet. And it was this ignorance that struck the ancient city the most terrible blow. When you don't suspect there is a void under your floor, you do nothing to protect it. You just live, and your ordinary life slowly turns into a destructive force. Domestic sewage from houses seep through the soil for years, drop by drop. Dirty water from laundries and toilets flowed down, entering ancient wells and corridors. This didn't just dampen the walls, it literally dissolved them. The water washed away soil particles from which all these halls were carved, turning firm earth into soft slush. What stood unshakable for 1,500 years began to slowly slump and lose its shape. Walls that withstood the blows of battering rams and the weight of centuries couldn't resist ordinary modern sewage. When archaeologists finally entered the system after its accidental discovery, they froze in horror. Instead of quietly studying finds and describing artifacts, they had to turn into rescuers. The first task wasn't research, but almost firefighting. They had to urgently understand where the damage had already become irreversible. Scientists tried in a hurry to divert the sewage that continued to pour from above and reinforce risk zones. In some places, the ceilings and walls were in such a state that they could collapse at any second, forever burying under the rubble those parts of the city that no one had managed to see yet. It is a paradoxical situation. Time in Nushabad was divided into before and after the discovery. Before the shovel struck the void, people harmed the ancient system without any malicious intent. They just lived as everyone lives who has ordinary soil under their feet. And it was precisely this normality of their actions, combined with the incredible fragility of what is hidden below, that created an invisible catastrophe that now has to be corrected at the cost of enormous efforts. Dirty water destroyed the system from the inside, but this was only the tip of the iceberg. The underground city was arranged in such a way that it required constant attention and care. As soon as people stopped using it as their second home, problems began that nature itself could not cope with. And time, which used to be Nushabad's ally, turned into its main enemy. If sewage from houses is a man-made tragedy, the real war with nature begins even deeper. Nushabad's main enemy today is not time or people, but ordinary groundwater. Slowly but surely, it is invading the lower tiers of the system. In certain seasons, the water rises and completely floods the deepest tunnels, turning the unique architecture into an underwater crypt. And for the ancient soil, this is not just dampness, it's a sentence. Water works here as a destroyer that has no weekends or breaks. It constantly undermines what people built over centuries. The lowest level, which goes 18 meters underground, turned out to be in the most dangerous trap. It is both the most valuable for science and the most risky. It is practically impossible to investigate this place normally because the water makes the walls unstable. That is exactly why a large part of the city is still closed to tourists. You can't just let people into a place where the floor can turn into quicksand at any moment, and the ceiling can collapse under the weight of accumulated water pressure over the years. It would be a risk not only to ancient stones, but also to the lives of those who decide to descend. The work of archaeologists here is more like a complex engineering operation. You can't just walk in with a brush and start clearing artifacts. First, you have to become a hydrologist. Understand exactly where the water is seeping from and how it moves within the soil layers. Then you have to build drainage to literally pump out death from these walls. And only after the soil stabilizes and becomes dry can documentation begin. This process is incredibly long, and requires enormous resources that are not always available. That is why, many years after Nushabad was seen again by people, it still remains a mystery. We cannot speed up this process without risking losing everything at once. The physics of the system dictates its own rules. Either you act slowly and carefully, or the ancient city will finally dissolve in the groundwater. But while scientists fight for every meter of already found tunnels, something even more massive is hidden behind their walls. That part of the system that hasn't seen the light of lanterns yet remains the main promise of this place. What is shown to tourists today in Nushabad is just a tiny lit-up patch in an infinite black void. It is a big mistake to think that the rest of the space is abandoned or considered unimportant. In fact, it is exactly the opposite. The majority of this giant labyrinth has not yet been traversed, recorded on camera, or even seen by the eyes of modern researchers. The real boundaries of what is hidden underground remain the region's biggest mystery. We still don't know exactly where this city ends or how many more levels it might hide in its depths. This makes Nushabad completely unlike other ancient monuments. Take for comparison the famous underground cities of Cappadocia in Turkey. There, everything has long been studied, catalogued, and turned into a well-oiled tourist assembly line. History has already frozen there and become an understandable exhibit. But Nushabad is an active search zone. Its map is being written right now, literally meter by meter every year. What today's visitor sees is only a small part of the system, its front entrance, while the main masses of the city are still waiting for their time behind collapses and untouched layers of earth. Just think about this fact. Right now, beneath residential blocks, busy streets, and modern houses, there are halls and passages that no beam of light has penetrated for hundreds of years. There, in absolute silence, the personal belongings of those who hid here from invaders may still lie. Forgotten jars of grain may stand, or unique signs on the walls may be preserved that will help scientists finally understand exactly when the first stone was laid. These are not just dusty archives, it is a real physical space located just a few meters beneath your sofa. The strangest and even slightly scary part of this whole story is the physical proximity of two worlds. While you on the surface discuss news or prepare lunch, right beneath you may be an engineering masterpiece that was once the only salvation for an entire civilization. This distance between the past and the present is so short that it can be measured with ordinary steps. The unexplored part of the city continues to breathe beneath modern Nushabad, forcing us to ask questions for which we don't yet have answers. Who were the builders of this place, really? How does their achievement relate to other wonders of the ancient world, and what can the architecture of survival tell us about the hidden power of human intellect? Imagine you need to build a multi-story house, but you have no paper, no pencil, and no computer. You have no way to look at the project from the outside or check the calculations. The builders of Nushabad left behind not a single blueprint, not a single instruction or technical note. They just took tools and bit into the earth, creating a complex system that modern scientists are still trying to decipher by studying every curve of the walls. The most incredible feat of these people is ventilation. Making air constantly move through a labyrinth hundreds of meters long at a depth of 3 floors without a single fan is a task that today requires the work of an entire engineering bureau. It was necessary to understand exactly how cold air displaces hot air, at what angle to drill the shafts, and what size the passage should be so that the draft remains stable at any time of the year. This wasn't a matter of chance. It was pure knowledge of physics accumulated through thousands of trials and errors, passed down not through books, but through calluses on hands and personal observation of how the earth breathes. It was even more difficult not to get lost in their own project. Building 3 levels of rooms and passages so that they wouldn't collapse on each other and had independent exits to the surface was a fantastic spatial task. The architects of Nushabad had to keep a massive 3-dimensional map in their heads without the ability to see it as a whole. They navigated only by their experience and memory, feeling the volume of the soil and the direction of the tunnels literally with their skin. Without laser levels or satellite navigation, they created an object where every corridor leads exactly where it needs to go. Nushabad is not just an ancient monument, it is living proof of what the human brain is capable of under conditions of severe resource scarcity. It is a hymn to the intellect that found brilliant solutions using only primitive tools and a deep understanding of the laws of nature. People created a system impossible for those times that worked perfectly. Today, this masterpiece is officially recognized as a national treasure and is open to the world. But the transition from an accidental find in a basement to the official status of a museum is a separate story of how our modern world tries to coexist with what it suddenly discovers beneath its soles. Everything happened incredibly fast by historical standards. Usually, decades of debates and red tape pass from the first accidental find to official recognition. But Nushabad was too massive to ignore. Already in 2006, this place was officially added to Iran's National Heritage List. Experts immediately realized they were not just looking at a couple of deep basements, but the largest underground city in the entire country. For the state, this became not an ordinary discovery, but a true treasure that could not simply be left buried in a long queue for study. Today, looking at Nushabad, it's hard to believe that until recently, only a few local families knew about it. The Tehran Times reported that in 2023, the city reopened its doors to the public after extensive restoration work. It turned out that people's interest in this place is simply colossal. Especially during Nowruz, the Iranian New Year, when special one-day tours are organized here. Huge lines for tickets prove that this labyrinth has stopped being a secret refuge and has turned into a vibrant point on the map, a must-visit in the Kashan region. Now this ancient wonder has everything a modern tourist site should. An official website, a clear schedule, and even its own social media pages. You can enter through the historic city center or find a second entrance right on the busy Imam Khomeini Street. Local authorities have taken full control of the management. They monitor the schedule, which changes depending on the season and weather, to ensure the tunnels remain dry and safe for visitors. It is no longer a closed zone where only scientists in helmets are allowed. It is a space where anyone can come, buy a ticket, and walk with their own feet through the same passages where hundreds of years ago people hid from enemies in absolute silence. Tourism has breathed a new, bustling life into these ancient walls. Now it doesn't smell of fear and uncertainty. The voices of tour guides and the clicks of smartphone cameras are heard here. But it is precisely this shine of official status and cash registers that creates the strangest contrast. While you walk along a lit and safe route, right behind thin partitions, the vast part of the system about which we still know almost nothing continues. And this paradox, when a living modern city stands on top of an unexplored ancient iceberg, forces us to ask the final and most important question in this long story. Nushabad today is perhaps the only place on the planet where your morning grocery run happens right over the heads of an ancient civilization. You can calmly pick out ripe tomatoes in a shop without even thinking that just 10 meters below your soles, a complex 3-story labyrinth is hidden. And in the evening, you will walk just 100 meters down the same street, buy a ticket, and descend into that very world you were just standing over. Both of these things, the noisy modern shop and the silent ancient city, are an absolutely normal and familiar part of the same day for every local resident. Of course, many cities in the world stand on the ruins of the past. In Rome, ancient temples are found beneath modern apartments. In Jerusalem, entire eras are piled on top of each other like layers of an infinite historical cake. But Nushabad differs fundamentally from all of them in one important detail. What lies beneath these streets is not just old foundations, broken pottery, or forgotten sewers. It is a consciously created, technically complex, and fully living space. It is not a cemetery of history, but literally a second city that existed in parallel with the first for centuries. Try to appreciate the full scale and boldness of this idea. One city was intended for peaceful and cool days, and its exact underground copy waited for its time in case of hellish heat or a sudden attack. Two complete worlds at one geographical point, one on top of the other. This is probably the most radical and desperate decision a group of people can make when the environment becomes too hostile. They didn't try to defeat the harsh desert, and they didn't abandon their homes to flee from it. Instead, they created a duplicate reality that turned on every time life on the surface stopped being safe. The people who built all this with their hands lived here for centuries, worked in the fields, and raised children. Every one of them knew exactly where, under their own kitchen floor or rug, the entrance to another dimension was hidden. For them, this wasn't an incredible miracle or heroism. It was an ordinary rule of life in this specific place, with this merciless, scorching sun and enemies who could appear on the horizon at any moment. They created a double city because one simply wasn't enough for them to stay alive. And this solution turned out to be so precise and reliable that it worked properly for centuries. It was preserved in such perfect condition that people living above today are still trying to fully grasp the grand and secret structure they walk over every day to work or the shop. The very same man who first drove a shovel into this tunnel didn't dream at all of becoming a great discoverer. He was just digging a hole for a new pipe or expanding his cellar, doing something as boring and mundane as possible. And the fact that he stumbled upon the entrance to another world was the result of pure chance. This is perhaps the most honest way to discover what was hidden for 1,500 years. After all, the underground city in Nushabad was built precisely so that it would never be found by strangers. It was created to be invisible, non-obvious, accessible only to the narrowest circle of their own people. And it performed this task brilliantly, remaining in the shadows until the very last moment. The city remained hidden for exactly as long as the thin living thread of memory lasted. It was passed down in whispers from father to son and from mother to daughter inside every house where the precious hatch was hidden. But at some point, that line simply broke, not because someone decided to keep the great secret in confidence, but simply because life changed. The need for underground shelters vanished along with the invaders and old wars. Memory wasn't erased intentionally, it simply evaporated, like the smell of old smoke, when the vital necessity for it disappeared. The underground world remained in total solitude, continuing its existence on its own, already without those who knew about it. This is perhaps the most accurate description of how our memory of man-made things actually works. It lives only as long as people need to remember in order to survive. As soon as the danger goes away, we discard old tools of salvation as unnecessary, not even caring to preserve them in stories. And when, several centuries later, an ordinary worker's shovel struck the void beneath the floor, it wasn't a long-awaited reunion with the past. It was a sudden encounter with the physical result of decisions made by people who had long ago turned to dust. We were faced with answers to questions we had long stopped asking ourselves. They went underground to survive. They survived. They were able to return to the surface and continue their lineage. The city above ground grew, was built, and changed, while the city underground simply remained waiting in absolute silence. And it waited. Right now, beneath the most ordinary streets of an ordinary Iranian city, lies a giant 3-level labyrinth with rooms, wells, and ventilation. Most of it is still unexplored, untraversed, and misunderstood by modern man. That space is there at this very second, right beneath the feet of people who are just going about their business, unaware of what an abyss opens beneath their souls. Right now.